Hello friends, and welcome to Jocelyn's Twilight Years, how to be a really old model. Today I have a subject to talk about that I've been wanting to talk about for 15 months. The reason I haven't been able to talk about it is because it has only just been concluded, so up till this point I've not had anything useful to say, although I've had many things I have wanted to say. So the topic I'm going to talk about today is being investigated by the UK Tax Authority, which is called HMRC. For Americans watching, that is the British equivalent of the IRS. And when you are self-employed or a company, as I am, they are allowed to investigate you for any number of reasons. Firstly, and I think the reason that they most often investigate people is if they think you've done something wrong. Secondly, if there is one aspect of your business that really puzzles them, if you're in a very atypical business, they can do what's called an aspect inquiry. Or thirdly, if you're in the unlucky 7% of the investigations they do each year, it is entirely random, like a lottery that no one wants to win. So I won. In June 2017, my accountant contacted me to tell me that HMRC had decided to investigate me. Now, when they do a random investigation, they only investigate 1 year. So they were looking at my 2015 to 2016 tax year, which was probably quite good news for me because it was relatively recent, so I remembered it fairly well. And also, I think as time has gone on, my record keeping has got better. So if I look back at when I started my job as a model back in 2003, I didn't know much about how to run a business. So although I no longer have the accounts from that far back, it probably involved a lot more guesswork than it does now. So they can only investigate you 7 years back, unless they have reason to believe you've been doing something criminally terrible. So they could have gone back to a year that I didn't remember quite as well. So 2015 to 2016 didn't seem like too bad of a deal. When I heard this not very good news, I decided that I would make notes of everything that happened so that I could give advice to other self-employed people, specifically to self-employed models, because it turns out that even professional accountants often aren't sure what to do with a profession like this, which is relatively recent, because there haven't been many investigations of freelance models yet, so no one's really sure what the rules are as to what we can claim for and what we can't. So I have learned a lot in these last 15 months, and 2 days ago I got a letter from them finally to say that they had concluded their investigation and that there were no findings, which means that everything I had done they accepted and agreed that it was legitimate for business, which is great news for me, because I have to say, if you're watching this because you have just found out you're being investigated, I want to be of comfort. The first thing I thought was, obviously I must have done something wrong and I'll probably go to prison, and if I don't go to prison I'll probably get a massive fine and be put out of business. I think I am someone who naturally tends to feel guilty quite easily, and I have to say that one of the worst things about being investigated in the early stages was the helpful and kind advice that people tried to give me, because I think most of us are a bit scared of the tax man. And so I was the recipient, as soon as I started telling people I was being investigated, of a lot of quite pessimistic advice. So the first thing I remember someone saying to me on social media was that it's not a random investigation. They've said it's a random investigation, but it isn't, because they never do that. So it's because they're actually suspicious you've done something wrong. Which I can see he may have believed that, but it is very unhelpful advice to be given, because in fact that's not true. They do random investigations, but also sort of telling the person who's just heard they're being investigated that there must be a reason makes you feel a whole lot worse. Another thing many people said to me was, well, the HMRC will always find something to blame you for, because they have to justify the investigation. So however clean your books are, they will find something to charge back, which again has turned out to be entirely pessimistic, entirely untrue, and actually a very unhelpful thing to have said to you. I was also told that I wouldn't be able to claim any of my extra accountancy bills against tax. Obviously, as soon as you start being investigated, if you have an accountant, HMRC start asking your accountant to do a whole load of extra work for you, which you have to pay for, and I was told that I wouldn't be able to claim for that. In fact, there is a grain of truth to that. You cannot claim if you are found to be fraudulent, because they don't want you basically using a whole team of accountants to argue your case and claim the whole thing against tax. But as it happens, the entirety of my accountant's bill is going to be tax deductible. I have no idea how much it's going to be though. So I thought, given that I got a whole load of advice that was extremely unhelpful, although kindly intentioned, I thought I would give you my advice based on what I have learned in the investigation. The first thing that happened with the investigation, once my accountant got in touch with me, was that they asked for supporting documents for the year that they were investigating. So firstly, that meant bank statements for the whole year from my business, which was fine. I'm sure most of us have those printed out, so that was no problem at all. They also asked for my invoices, which was a problem because I do not invoice. I have never invoiced, and my accountant has never asked me to invoice. It turns out that actually you don't have to invoice, whether you're a sole trader or a limited company, as long as you have a diary with records of all your bookings, which I do have. Unfortunately, I have kept my diaries with no expectation that anyone else would ever look at them. So they are A, full of cake crumbs, B, written illegibly, and C, have a whole load of personal information in them, including just sometimes a whole day will just have the word bondage written in big writing because I'm doing a bondage shoot and I'm happy. So sending them off was not a great feeling. In my case, my diaries are relatively personal. So if you don't want to ever be in that position, I suggest you either invoice or you keep a very business-like diary separate from any of your personal diary entries, so that if you have to send something off, you will have something you're not embarrassed by, because I was very embarrassed. Thirdly, they asked me for records of all the places I'd been to work. So they asked me basically to provide supporting information for the mileage I'd claimed. So the first bit of advice I would give you if you are investigated by HMRC or the IRS, I'm sure, is give them everything fast. When I heard I was being investigated, I wanted them to be in no doubt that I had all this information. I wanted them not to think that I was scrabbling around trying to make this stuff up on the spot. So I had everything with them within 24 hours. I'm sure that was probably me being anxious and doing overkill, but I do think that that probably makes quite a favourable impression. However fast you do things for them, it doesn't mean they will do things fast for you. Oh no. It turns out my accountant discovered that basically it takes a month for any bit of post to get from one department in HMRC to another department in HMRC. Their internal systems are hideous, and anything they post to you normally takes about 8 weeks in my experience, which is awful, awful, awful. So that's what I learned. You should be really fast giving them information. They will be incredibly slow giving you information. So after my advice to move fast and keep good records so that you can move fast, the next thing I wanted to talk about is whether or not to have an accountant. And for the first 5 years of my business, I didn't have an accountant. I did it all myself. And if I'd been investigated during those years, I think it would have been an immensely stressful experience, because although I wouldn't have had to pay anyone, I wouldn't have understood what they were talking about either. So up until the point at which I had to actually meet them face to face, I might have been okay, but in the actual face-to-face meeting I had with them and my accountant, some of the time I literally had no idea what they were talking about. At one point they were asking about a director's loan, and I didn't even know I'd got a director's loan. I genuinely had no idea. Now, it was all above board and legitimate, but I'd just not heard a lot of the terminology before, and without an accountant, I think it would have been so stressful. My accountancy bill has normally been between £300 and £500 a year, maybe a little more now that I'm incorporated, but it's worth it. And the amount of tax they save you by knowing the rules hopefully, about what you can claim is more than worth it as well. So I thought the next thing I probably want to talk about is why you should pay tax honestly, because one of the things that made this investigation so incredibly stressful is that basically HMRC and tax authorities generally are very suspicious of people who get paid a lot of cash, because the potential for them to try to hide their earnings is greater. I pay my taxes honestly, but in the course of my career I have met many people who have openly admitted to defrauding the taxman. My feeling on this is that you are not striking some blow for the common man. You might think you are, but all you're doing is stealing from people who are on PAYE schemes where they have to pay their tax before they even get their money. So I think if you want to be supportive of all the people in this country who are employees and don't have any option but to pay their tax honestly, I think that you need to be declaring your earnings honestly. Sadly, I do not think that all professional models by any means do that, and if you are watching this, here are some reasons why you should. Firstly, being investigated is incredibly stressful. I knew that I had declared every single job that I did in the tax year that they investigated. If I hadn't known that, I cannot imagine how stressful the last 15 months of my life would have been. As it is, it has been horrible. I would not have wanted to go through that knowing all the time that there was something I needed them not to find. They are the experts, I am not the expert, and it would have been untenably stressful. Secondly, don't be an idiot. Don't assume that cash isn't traceable. I think that once upon a time, perhaps cash wasn't very traceable, but these days, if you take bookings, for example, via email or via an online booking system, the tax authority will ask you for those supporting documents. So just because you were paid in cash at the end of the booking, it doesn't mean that there's no record of that booking. Anything on a portfolio builder site like Purpleport or Model Mayhem, or emails, or Facebook messages, or text messages could potentially be seen by the tax authority. So the fact that you were paid in cash really doesn't help you if you're trying to defraud them. There are many reasons not to lie about your income, but one of them is that it is bloody stupid. Don't exaggerate your expenses. I'm just going to read this paragraph I wrote because it's important. Many of the questions I was asked when I met them face to face related to whether my business expenses were, and there's an expression for this, were wholly and exclusively work related. So if you had a holiday and did a bit of modelling while you were there, you cannot claim expenses for the whole trip. If you do, you're going to have to look someone in the eye and explain why that was 100% a work trip. And I would not be wanting to do that. As it was, I had to look them in the eye and explain why trips that were 100% work were 100% work. And even that, to be honest, was pretty stressful when they started asking me if I ever took days off while I was in America and did tourist things. The answer is no. If I'm working abroad, I'm working abroad, and that's all I'm doing. And I've got proof that I've done 10-hour days for 2 weeks in a row, and I haven't taken any days off. But if I hadn't declared all my earnings for that period and was then trying to claim all my expenses, I would have been in a very bad situation indeed. Do not make the mistake that they won't look at your social media presence. At my meeting with HMRC, they asked me for my social media identities, and I don't know whether they looked or not, but they certainly could have done. And if I had a whole load of holiday pictures up or things that I was boasting about that wouldn't have been borne out by my paperwork, I would have been very, very disadvantaged by that. If you buy clothing that's partially for work but partially for your personal use, don't try to claim it all for work. Again, if there are pictures of you all over Facebook at a friend's wedding in a dress, you don't want to have tried to put that dress through as a business expense. Maybe I'm being over paranoid having just gone through this situation, but it was hugely comforting for me to know that my modelling clothes are my modelling clothes. They do not feature in my personal life's wardrobe. I've heard many self-employed people over the years that I've been self-employed telling me about things they've kind of got away with when they probably shouldn't have done, including someone who claimed for a whole new bathroom in his house and said it was a photo set. Like, I would not be wanting to try to explain that to HMRC. It would be absolutely hellish to do that. I've probably said this already, but make sure your online presence is compatible with your declared earnings. If you're talking about location shoots, bookings, earnings online, you need to make sure your paperwork reflects that, because a switched on investigator, and in all honesty I'm not sure how many of them actually are switched on, they seem not very, but a switched on investigator will probably check and notice. This is one that I once would have really come unstuck with. I've always been honest, but I haven't been always organised. So make sure your bank statements reflect your earnings and your expenses. So, for example, if you go on tour and earn £2,000, it's better to pay £2,000 of cash, if you get paid in cash, into the bank than to use that cash to pay your business expenses as you go around the country and then just pay the remainder into the bank. It just leaves a much clearer paper trail if you are able to show all your earnings made it into the bank. It's not illegal to do it another way, but it's simpler and it's clearer for the tax authority to adjudicate. For the first few years of my career, I had one bank account for my personal and my business expenses and earnings. And since I switched to having a separate business account, things have been much clearer for me, and then eventually for the HMRC when they investigated me. I was really glad not to have to send my personal statements off, because it would have been a much less clear picture. So I definitely recommend getting a business account. Business accounts normally come with a monthly fee, but if you don't want a real business account, you can always just have a separate personal account but use it for your business. So after 9 months of the investigation going pretty much nowhere, for 9 months they basically looked through an envelope of receipts, 12 bank statements and a couple of sheets of paper, and having not got very far, they eventually asked for a face-to-face meeting with me. Now at that point I was quite nervous, because I assumed that they wouldn't do that and waste all the taxpayers' money travelling from Leeds to London and staying in a hotel to interview someone who they thought was innocent. But having met them, I think that's exactly what they do. I don't think they care very much about how much it's costing the taxpayer to do these investigations and how much money they're really getting back. I guess because they are a large and probably quite inefficient organisation, they do not seem particularly worried about that kind of thing. So now, knowing what I know now, I wouldn't be so nervous about them wanting to meet me. But at the time, I was very nervous, because I thought, why? And wondered if there was going to be a policeman there just waiting to arrest me. But I would like to reassure you, if you are going through this, that in person, the HMRC, I did not find them to be combative at all. They probably know that they scare us, and as a result, they try quite hard to come across as friendly and non-confrontational. That's not to say that they are efficient, because they certainly aren't, but they are pleasant. However, they do make notes on everything you say. Again, I can only reiterate that if I hadn't been relying on the truth, I would have been much more nervous, because having someone ask you very unexpected questions that I hadn't seen coming at all, and then writing down your answers as you speak, I think would be very unnerving if you were making up those answers. The next thing that happens is that after your meeting, they send you a transcript. This was the point at which I started having to learn to stand my ground, because up to this point they had been very slow and not very efficient, but very pleasant. But this was the first time I felt like they were actually trying to trap me, because the transcript differed in a few important ways from the actual conversation we'd had. Mainly because they were trying to push blame onto me for things they hadn't done. So by law, when you are notified that you're going to be investigated, they have to send you a fact sheet, which they did not send to me. So on the day, they showed me this fact sheet and asked if I had seen a copy of it, and I said I had not. In the transcript, they had written that I couldn't remember if I'd seen it, which sounds like a very small difference, but in fact it let them off the hook of having not sent it at all. In my subsequent experiences with HMRC, I discovered that they were incapable of sending anything to my address. So in fact, the transcript that they sent to me didn't come to me. It was the point at which I discovered I had to be quite assertive, which normally shouldn't be too hard a thing to be, But I think in the context of talking to a part of the government that is so scary as the tax authority kind of are, it is quite hard to be assertive and to insist on them changing things that you don't think are right. So I do encourage you, if you go through this, show your hand quite early in proceedings and be firm, be assertive and insist on things happening on time. I wish I had been stricter earlier in this process. So on that subject, chase them up. Left to their own devices, they are glacially slow. I have never dealt with such an inefficient organisation. If anyone running their own company, as I do, was as inefficient and as bad at deadlines as they are, we wouldn't be in business. It's extraordinary. It's genuinely dizzyingly awful how slow they are. I resorted eventually, when they'd missed a deadline by 2 weeks, I resorted to telephoning them every day, tweeting to them every day, and to leaving hysterical voicemails on their phones every day until they closed my investigation. I don't think you should have to do this sort of thing, but I don't know how else I would have got them to finally close my case. The reason I think this prompted action is that, as it happens, the way that a case is closed, what's meant to happen is that they send you this transcript, you sign it, your accountant signs it, they sign it, and then they decide what to do with the case. I said I wouldn't sign the transcript because it wasn't accurate, so they were meant to go away and they were meant to amend it, then they were meant to send it to my accountant and me to sign. This has never happened. So something that, according to them, is a vital part of the investigation has been skipped in my case, so I can only assume they felt eventually pressurised by the amount of contact I was making with them to close the case anyway, which is great for me, but it makes me suspicious that if you were not prepared to take that kind of action, they might drag this kind of case out for years. Not because they want to necessarily, and not because they are trying to find anything about you, but simply because they are not efficient and organised. This may be because they are hideously understaffed and underfunded. I really don't know. It seems quite likely. So I don't blame the individuals involved in my investigation, but geez, as a department, I have to say, they are extraordinarily amateurish. So I think they know they're scary, and as a result they're not used to people being assertive with them. It took me over a year to gather the courage to be anything like assertive with them and to start holding them accountable for missed deadlines, but it was very productive when I got to that point. However, if you thought you'd actually done anything wrong, I doubt you'd be in a position to be that assertive with them, which is another reason to just be honest. Allowable, okay. So I think that's where I'm going to finish this video, but I'm going to follow it up with another video about the things that now I can definitively tell you are allowable expenses for models. Because I speak to a lot of models with accountants, I know that each accountant varies quite widely in what they will allow the models on their books to claim, which is very unhelpful. I've heard from various models, some of whom have accountants who won't even let them claim for clothing and cosmetics, which I don't understand at all, but I'm just going to go through. Now that my accounts have been cleared 100% with no adjustments by the HMRC, I can tell you, at least if you are a British model, and at least at this point in history, these are the things that you can legitimately claim for without any worry at all, because HMRC have literally just looked at my accounts and they have cleared all of this. So thank you for listening. I will be back with the definitive list of what a model can claim for next month. But in the meantime, I'm sorry that was a serious topic, but to be fair to all the people who've supported me during this 15 months of stupidity, I really wanted to make a detailed video about it. Now that it's over, I do need to say that I wish one thing. I wish that I had insurance against this eventuality. So many accountants carry insurance against being investigated, which you can take out with them. If your accountant doesn't offer this, you can get it for yourself. Now, I'd vaguely heard about this idea, but I thought it would make you look terribly guilty to have any insurance against being investigated. However, the insurance against being investigated does not pay the fine that you get if you are found guilty. It pays your accountancy bills, and at the time of making this video, I don't know yet what my accountancy bill is going to be. It's going to be pretty steep because my accountant had to do a lot of extra work and he had to come to London to meet the HMRC with me. So it's been extra work that he's been doing for me for 15 months, and I can't imagine that's going to come cheap, but I will update in the comments when I know what his bill is, and then you can make an assessment for yourself as to whether insurance would seem worth it to you or not. Generally, I'm kind of against insurance. I'd rather just save money and have it for any eventuality. But knowing what I know now, this whole event would have been much less stressful if only I had. It would have taken a lot of the stress out. So I will be back with the definitive guide of what an internet model can claim as expenses in the near future. So thank you for now for watching.